They thought they were just trimming a few branches, and I ended up trimming about 40 grand off their bottom line. Not with yelling, not with threats, not even with a raised voice, just paperwork, patience, and letting the right people do their jobs. And the craziest part is the first time I realized what was happening, I was standing there in my socks with a cup of coffee staring at sunlight that had no business being in my backyard. So, let me back up. I live in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Cedar Hollow, the kind of place where people wave when they drive by, where the biggest arguments are usually about trash cans being left out too long like it's some kind of federal offense. I bought my house almost 12 years ago. Nothing fancy. A simple ranch-style place with a deep backyard, and honestly the main reason I fell for it in the first place, 6 massive oak trees running along the back property line. Those oaks were here long before I was. Thick trunks, heavy canopies, the kind of shade that drops the temperature 10 degrees in July. In the summer half, my yard stays cool and dim like nature built me a porch roof for free. And I didn't even realize how much those trees mattered to me until someone treated them like they were disposable. I work from home, so I spend a lot of time looking out the back window. Morning coffee, laptop, open dog on the floor like a warm, judgmental rug. The wind moves through those leaves and it's calming. Those trees weren't just landscaping, they were part of the rhythm of my days. Then early March rolls around and the house behind mine sells. The previous owner was an older guy named Martin, kept to himself mostly. We'd do the occasional fence line small talk, complain about property taxes, that sort of thing. When he moved out, I figured whoever came next would be the same quiet, polite, invisible. Instead, in came a couple in their late 30s, maybe early 40s. Let's call them Evan and Claire. 2 kids, a golden retriever, 2 SUVs, and the kind of energy that always feels like it's about to rearrange the furniture. At first, everything was normal. The standard neighbor meet and greet. I brought over a 6-pack, welcomed them to the neighborhood. Evan had a firm handshake, steady eye contact, the kind of guy who smiles without showing his teeth. He mentioned casually that he worked in residential redevelopment. Bought homes, renovated them, resold them. He said it like it was just a hobby, but I clocked it. This wasn't a forever home, this was inventory. Claire asked about schools, the kids ran around my yard chasing my dog, and we stood near the fence line while the sun filtered through the oak leaves. I remember thinking, all right, this'll be fine. And then by mid-April, I noticed something feels off. One morning, I step outside with my coffee and there's sunlight hitting a part of my yard that had never seen direct sun before. It took me a second to even understand what I was looking at. The canopy along the fence looked thinner, uneven, like someone took a bite out of it. I walked closer. Several branches were gone. Not broken, not storm damaged. Clean cuts. Fresh, pale wood exposed where dark bark used to be. Whoever did it knew how to use a saw. And they hadn't just trimmed what crossed over into their yard. Some of those cuts were a good 2 or 3 feet into my property. I walked the entire fence line, counted at least a dozen missing branches. A couple of them were thick enough that you don't remove them with garden clippers. You remove them with a chainsaw. I just stood there longer than I'd like to admit, staring up at the gaps like, how did somebody think this was okay? It's weird how fast something like that starts to feel personal. Not, I'm gonna fight you in the street personal, more like someone walked into your house and moved your furniture around while you were asleep. You can't explain it, but you feel violated. Still, I didn't storm over. I didn't start yelling. I went inside, put my coffee down, and walked around to their front door. Evan answered. Hey man, I said keeping it light, keeping it level. Quick question. Did you have someone trim the oak branches along the back fence? He didn't even hesitate. Yeah, he said. They were hanging over our yard, blocking light. Figured I'd take care of it. I nodded slowly. I get trimming what crosses the line, I told him, but some of those cuts are on my side. And he leans against the doorframe like we're discussing lawn fertilizer. It's the same tree, he says. What's the difference? I remember blinking like my brain needed a second to catch up with the audacity. The difference, I said, is you stepped onto my property and cut into my trees without asking. He gives me this little shrug. Not angry, not even defensive, just dismissive. They'll grow back, he says. They're trees. That part stuck with me. Not the words exactly, more the attitude. The way he minimized it like I was complaining about spilled milk. I told him I wasn't okay with it, and that if something crossed the property line in the future, we'd talk first. He nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was a placeholder nod. Conversation over. Door closed. And I'm standing there on his porch for a beat too long, feeling that slow burn settle in my chest. That afternoon, I called a certified arborist. Not because I was trying to start a war, but because I genuinely didn't know if those cuts mattered. Like, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe trees really do just grow back and I'm being dramatic. The arborist came out 2 days later. Older guy named Russell. Sun-weathered skin clipboard tucked under one arm, the kind of man who's seen every dumb thing humans can do to a tree and is no longer surprised by any of it. He walked the fence line the same way I had, except he kept shaking his head. "These weren't done properly," he said. "Cuts are too close to the trunk. No regard for collar preservation." I'm not gonna lie, I didn't even know trees had collars. Russell might as well have been speaking another language, but his tone was crystal clear. This was bad. "That opens the tree up to disease," he said. I asked him straight because I didn't want a lecture, I wanted the bottom line. "Are they going to die?" Russell took a breath like he didn't enjoy answering questions like that. "Hard to say," he said. "Oaks are resilient, but topping or improper cuts can stress them out. You're looking at possible decay, structural weakness later on. If one goes, removal alone could be 5-6 grand. Then he gave me an estimate for preventative treatment and potential damage around 3,000 depending on how things progressed. And that number, it flipped a switch in me. Up until then, this was about respect, about boundaries, about not acting like my yard was your personal supply closet. But $3,000. Now it was about real financial impact. So I drafted a letter. Calm, factual, no insults. I included Russell's report photos and a request that Evan cover the treatment costs and refrain from any further trimming without written agreement. I mailed it certified because I'm the kind of person who likes receipts when people start pretending they don't remember things. No response. 2 weeks pass. And then one morning at 7:12 a.m., I wake up to the sound of a chainsaw. Not distant, not vague, right outside my bedroom window. And if you've ever been jolted awake by a chainsaw, you know it doesn't just wake you up. It hijacks your nervous system. It rattles through the walls, gets into your bones, and settles right in your chest like a threat. I was out of bed before I fully woke up. Pulled on jeans, didn't even bother with a shirt. Just stepped into boots and headed straight for the backyard. And there he is. Evan, not a crew, not a guy he hired. Evan himself standing in my yard on a ladder, cutting straight through the main leader of one of the biggest oaks. For a second, I just froze. My brain couldn't process it, because this wasn't trimming overhang anymore. He was topping the tree, taking the crown off like it was a hedge. "Hey," I yelled, and my voice came out rough, half sleep, half rage. He looks down at me, kills the saw, calm as ever. "Morning," he says, like we're neighbors saying hi on a jog. "Get off my property," I snapped. He glances around like he needs confirmation that the ground under his feet exists. "The trunk straddles the line," he says. Figured I'd even it out. Even it out. That phrase still makes my eye twitch. "You're butchering it," I said. He sighs like I'm being dramatic. "It was blocking our upstairs light. Claire wants more sun in the kids' rooms. It's not personal." And that line lodged itself in my head like a splinter. It's not personal. "You're standing in my yard with a chainsaw." I said, "It is personal." We stared at each other for a long second. Then he climbs down. No apology, no acknowledgement, just carries the saw back across the fence like he borrowed a rake. I walked over to the tree. The top was gone. Just flat exposed, ruined this ugly silhouette against the sky. Like somebody shaved a lion's mane and told it to relax, it'll grow back. I called Russell again. He came out that afternoon and didn't even try to hide his frustration. "Topping is one of the worst things you can do to an oak," he said. "It shocks the system. You'll get weak regrowth, water sprouts, possible decay." Then he looked up at what Evan had done and said quieter this time, "That tree might not recover." That night I didn't sleep. Not because of the noise, because of the pattern. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Evan knew I objected. He knew I'd sent documentation. He knew there was a line and he stepped over it anyway because the math said he could. And at around 2 in the morning, I did what most people do when they feel powerless. I started researching. Evan had told me he worked in redevelopment. I found his professional profile, easily managing partner at a small firm that specialized in value-add residential transformations. I actually laughed when I read that phrase because it sounds like something you say when you want to make flipping houses feel like a noble calling. But the deeper I dug, the more something clicked. They hadn't moved in emotionally. They'd moved in strategically. That house wasn't a home to them. It was a project. Buy low, renovate, sell high within 12 months. And the backyard, the light exposure, the look from upstairs windows, those weren't lifestyle choices. Those were resale considerations. And once I understood that, my whole mindset shifted. Because if this was an investment for them, then investment math applied. And investments are sensitive to risk. The next morning, instead of marching back over there, I called the city's urban forestry department. Turns out in Cedar Hollow, any tree over a certain trunk diameter is considered protected canopy. Even on private property, any significant trimming requires a permit. And topping, absolutely prohibited without review. So I asked a simple question. What happens if someone cuts without a permit? They sent an inspector. I submitted photos. Russell's written assessment. A property survey showing the trunk base clearly inside my boundary. 3 days later, a city truck pulled up in front of Evan's house. I watched from my kitchen window while the inspector walked the fence line, measured trunk diameter, took photos, and knocked on Evan's door. That conversation was longer than mine had been. Later that afternoon, I got a call. No permit had been filed. Multiple violations. Fine assessed. $1,500. Not life-changing money, but it was official. Documented. It meant I wasn't just the cranky neighbor who loves trees. I was the guy whose complaint had teeth. And that's when I started looking beyond the trees. Because once you realize someone is willing to break rules right in front of you, you start wondering what else they're breaking when nobody's watching. If you've ever bought a house, you know everything leaves a paper trail. Permits, additions, inspections. So I pulled the public property records for Evan's place. The listing when he bought it advertised a newly finished basement and a custom backyard deck. Big selling points, lots of glossy language. But when I checked the permit history, nothing. No approved basement finishing, no deck permit, no electrical inspection, no plumbing sign-off. Now, to be fair, it could have been the previous owner's oversight. Maybe Martin cut corners before selling, who knows. But here's the thing about flipping houses. Once you buy it, it becomes your problem. And if you plan to resell within a year, unresolved violations aren't just annoying. They're expensive surprises that can turn profit into panic. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen for a long time, feeling that tight, complicated knot in my gut. There's a line between protecting yourself and escalating out of spite. I knew that. I could feel it. But I also knew something else. If I let this go, it wouldn't stop, because from Evan's perspective, the math said he could keep pushing. Minimal resistance, maximum outcome. So I called the city's building department. And I didn't accuse, I didn't rant, I didn't even mention Evan's name like I was trying to ruin his life. I asked questions. I'm looking at public records, I said. I don't see permits for the finished basement or the deck at 214 Ridgeview. Should those be on file? The woman on the phone paused. I could hear typing. No permits recorded for those improvements, she said. I asked, what happens if a property is sold with unpermitted work listed as a feature? She didn't sound shocked. She sounded tired, like she'd had this conversation 1,000 times. We need to inspect, she said. I gave her the address. 2 weeks later, another city vehicle showed up. This time it wasn't forestry. It was building compliance. The inspector spent almost 3 hours inside that house. I know because Evan texted me halfway through. Did you call the city on us? I stared at that message for a long time, thumb hovering, thinking about everything. My tree, my letter, the chainsaw. The way he'd said it's not personal. I responded carefully. I reported damage to my trees. The rest is public record. He didn't reply. By evening, word spread. Our neighborhood isn't big and people get curious when city trucks show up. Claire was outside pacing on her phone, the kids stayed inside, and the golden retriever barked every time a truck door slammed. 2 days later, I saw the notice taped to their front window. Multiple code violations, unpermitted electrical in the basement, improper plumbing tie-ins, deck footings not up to current structural standards, basement egress windows too small to meet safety requirements, which meant before resale everything had to be corrected, not patched. Corrected. Deck torn down and rebuilt to code. Electrical and plumbing opened up and re-inspected. Basement windows enlarged. And if you've ever watched a house flip run on tight margins, you know what delays do. Every month that house doesn't sell is mortgage payments, contractor bills, permit fees, holding costs bleeding out in slow motion. A week later, Evan knocks on my door. First time he'd crossed the street voluntarily. We need to talk, he says. And his tone is different. Not dismissive. Controlled but strained, like he's trying to keep the anger from showing because he knows it won't help. We stood on my porch this time. You've made your point, he said. The tree, fine, whatever. But reporting the house, that's excessive. I looked at him for a long moment. Really looked. You came into my yard twice with a chainsaw after I asked you not to, I said. He runs a hand through his hair. It was just light. We needed light. You needed profit, I said quietly. And that landed because for the first time he didn't argue. He didn't deny it. His face tightened like he swallowed something bitter. You're going to cost us a lot of money, he said. I thought about Russell's estimate. About the hacked crown. About waking up to that chainsaw like someone revving a threat outside my window. You already cost me enough, I replied. He stared at me like he was recalculating the situation in real time, like the numbers weren't adding up the way he'd assumed they would. This isn't neighborly, he said. And I remember almost laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was so backwards. Neither is cutting down someone else's tree, I told him. There wasn't much left to say after that. Renovation trucks started showing up within days. The deck came down first, loud, messy boards, cracking nails, screeching. The backyard that had needed more light now looked like a construction zone. The irony wasn't lost on me. And I'll be honest, because I'm not going to pretend I'm some pure-hearted saint here. Every time I heard a hammer, part of me felt this grim satisfaction. Not joy exactly, more like relief, like consequences had finally entered the room. But it still wasn't over, because while the city handled permits and compliance, the damage to my trees was still sitting there unresolved, staring at me every time I looked out my back window. By summer, their house looked like it had been through a mild war. The deck was gone, just dirt and concrete footings sticking out like broken teeth. The basement windows were cut open wider, raw framing exposed for weeks. Electricians came and went, plumbers tore into drywall. Inspectors showed up with clipboards like clockwork. Every truck that pulled up cost them money. And through all of it, my oak stood there with its crown hacked off, trying to survive. Russell started treatment to prevent infection, but he'd been honest with me. The structural integrity would never be the same. It would regrow, sure, but weakly, chaotically. The shape was ruined. And the thought that decay might set in over the next few years, that removal might become unavoidable. It sat heavy with me because these weren't just trees anymore. They were part of my life. Here's the part people don't talk about when they tell stories like this. Retaliation doesn't feel clean. It doesn't feel like a movie. It's slow, administrative. It's paperwork and patience and waiting on other people's schedules. And while you're watching someone else's stress unfold in real time, you have to sit with your own motives. Was I protecting my property? Yes. Was there a part of me that wanted him to hurt the way I'd felt standing under that butchered canopy? Also, yes. Both things can be true, and that's what makes it messy. By August, I filed in small claims court. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't need to. I had documentation, photos from before and after, Russell's written evaluation, the city's violation record confirming unauthorized trimming, certified mail receipts showing I'd attempted resolution like a normal human being before things went nuclear. I requested the maximum allowable amount under our county limit, $10,000. Evan showed up to court in a pressed button-down legal pad in hand, like he thought looking professional would rewrite reality. Claire sat beside him, jaw tight, eyes tired, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. When the judge asked me to explain what happened, I kept it simple. No theatrics, just facts. Your Honor, I said I own 6 mature oak trees along my rear property line. The defendant entered my property without permission and removed substantial portions of one tree after being notified in writing not to. A certified arborist assessed the damage and determined improper cutting methods that may compromise the health and structural stability of the tree long term. The judge flipped through Russell's report, paused at photos, ran a finger down the page like he was reading a menu. Then he looked at Evan. Did you obtain a permit, he asked. Evan hesitated. No. Did you enter the plaintiff's property? Evan starts to talk about the trunk straddling the line, about how it's basically the same tree, and the judge cuts him off calm as a stone. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Yes, Evan said. And that was pretty much it. Court isn't dramatic. There's no music swelling. Just fluorescent lights, a clerk typing quietly in the corner, and a judge who's seen 1,000 versions of people trying to justify doing whatever they want. The ruling came 2 weeks later. $7,500 awarded in my favor. Not the full 10, but enough to matter. When the check arrived, I didn't celebrate. I deposited it, scheduled further preventative care for the trees, set some aside in case removal ever became necessary. It felt less like winning and more like stabilizing damage. Evan never spoke to me again after that. By November, construction behind me was finally done. Fresh deck, updated basement, new listing photos went live online. Fully renovated move-in ready sun-filled spaces. That last one almost made me laugh out loud. The house sat on the market longer than they expected. Interest rates had ticked up that fall, buyers were cautious, and once a property has a recent compliance history, inspections don't glide by the way flippers want them to. Eventually it sold. And when I checked public record, because yes, I checked, I'm human, the final sale price barely cleared what Evan had originally paid. Once you factor in closing costs, holding expenses, fines, reconstruction, the judgment, the lost time, the margins evaporated. That's the part people miss about this kind of thing. Evan thought small violations were just the cost of doing business. Trim here, cut there, push the line, shrug off complaints, squeeze more value out of sunlight like it was a faucet. But some costs compound, not because of revenge, because of accountability. One cold morning in early December, I watched a moving truck pull away for the last time. Evan stood in the driveway with his hands in his coat pockets. For a brief second, our eyes met across the fence line. No wave, no nod, just acknowledgement. And then he turned away and got in the car, and he was gone. A new family moved in the following spring. Young couple, first-time buyers. They came over with cookies. The first week smiled like they meant it. Asked about the trees. I told them what they needed to know, how old they were, how to care for them, how to handle anything near the fence line like adults. And then later that night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop closed, the house quiet, and I stared out at that one oak still scarred, still uneven. Here's the truth nobody wants when they expect a clean moral ending. I didn't win in some cinematic way. My tree is still damaged. It will never look the same. Every time I see that ugly regrowth, I'm reminded how fast someone will step over a boundary when it benefits them. But I also learned something about myself. I'm not confrontational by nature. I avoid drama. I like quiet solutions. Yet when pushed, I realized I'm patient, thorough, willing to play the long game. Hey. And that's a weird thing to discover about yourself because it's not flattering exactly. It's just real. I've replayed that first conversation on Evan's porch more times than I can count. Because if he'd knocked on my door before touching a single branch, we probably would have worked something out. If he'd apologized after the first incident, maybe I wouldn't have dug deeper. If he'd stopped after the letter, none of the rest would have happened. But he doubled down, and sometimes doubling down is what tips the scale, because it tells the other person you don't respect them enough to stop. So now I'm curious, genuinely curious, and I want you to tell me what you think. Did I go too far? Was reporting the unpermitted work crossing a line? Or was it simply holding someone accountable for risks they chose to take? At what point does protecting your property become retaliation? Because in neighborhoods like mine, where fences are close and lives overlap, that question matters more than people admit. Drop your thoughts, what's right, what's wrong, what you would have done instead. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who treated your boundaries like suggestions, I want to hear that too. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it sounds like paperwork being filed quietly and a chainsaw finally going silent.